My name is Courtney Osborn. I've been in cultivation for about 10 years. I guess let's just start off with are many people here familiar with cultivation or like bioreactors? We'll be getting into some a little bit more advanced cultivation techniques, more so than just your average oysters or at-home cultivation. So maybe a raise of hands. How many people are familiar with liquid culture? All right, so we got some people. Everybody knows what the liquid culture stuff. Okay, sweet. I have a few things that I'll pass around as we get there, but yeah, here's a little bit about me. I've been commercially cultivating for about 10 years. I have a lot of clients that I help with. We pretty much are on, as far as the East Coast, the West Coast, we're all over the place, from commercial size farms to really small scale farms and hobbyists, conservationists, that sort of thing. But yeah, pretty much have been doing this for a long time locally. We've been doing, farmers markets, that sort of thing, and the cooperatives who grow a lot of fresh mushrooms. So, um, but yeah, that's, a little bit about my history, but I'm also a little bit into like the scaling solutions. So a lot of what I do now is consulting for people and helping them go from being maybe like a basement grower to being, a large scale grower or like growing a couple 100 pounds a month or a week or whatever. So yeah, I'm kind of your guy, and a lot of what those techniques involve are what we're going to be going over today. So yeah. But we also do a lot of teaching stuff, so foraging events. Me and my buddy, he goes by the Mushroom Block, but we do a little pop-ups here and there. Sometimes we're at hydroponic shops, or just doing pop-ups at a local park or something. So, but yeah, we're hoping to do a lot more of those this year. Sometimes we bring cooking supplies and that sort of thing, and cook out, and that's it's a good time. So I'll hopefully post more of those events as we schedule some more of those. But um, yeah, and then a lot of also what I do is a lot of research as well. So from going into studying different techniques as far as improving labor intensive processes. With all my years of experience, that's kind of the biggest thing that I've found, is that this is one of the most labor intensive industries to be involved with. If you're just getting into it, just be aware of that, I guess. But yeah, research is a really big part of what keeps me motivated after 10 years of growing. You grow a couple million pounds of oysters and it starts to not be as fun anymore. So at some point now, I go out into the woods and I try to find, new and exciting mushrooms to cultivate and bring to my lab and isolate and take a little bit further. I actually have Bob here. He helps me identify some of the ones that I'm a little untoo sure of. So yeah, that's a little bit about, what I'm doing with the research. It goes from liquid culture research to outdoor cultivation to just mainly a lot of mushrooms. What interests me most is a lot of the mushrooms that are uncommonly cultivated, uh, just because I want to influence other people to actually grow some of these more obscure mushrooms. I think everyone has had their fill of oysters, so I feel like we can move on to some of the more fun ones. Um, but yeah, I've have about over 100 genetics in my library currently that I'm always going through and slowly updating and making sure that they still produce fruit. A lot of them are oysters, but a lot of them are mainly native local genetics that I've gone to the wild and harvested and brought back to my lab and grown out. So you get to see the whole process from the forest to my lab to the kitchen. So it's a good time. But yeah, this is the picture here on. Hold on, I brought this laser. So the picture on the yes, your left, that long one, it's about 10,000 pounds of substrate. And that would be about one cook that we were doing prior to some of this work. So that usually each one of those blocks will equate to about 2 pounds at a low estimate of mushrooms per block. So if you do the math, each cook is, two times about 1,000, so 2,000 pounds at a minimum, if not more. And then next to it, there's a picture of a bunch of lion's mane there. The lion's mane, everybody loves lion's mane. It's good for, the medicinal aspects of it as well. It's got a lot of research behind it currently, more so on the mycelium, but also the fruiting body as well. So it's something that I've also been getting really interested in with as well recently, with especially the liquid culture aspects of it, which we'll get into a little bit later. Um, this big unit there is a retort. That's a big pressure cooker essentially. So if you're not too familiar with what the process is here, it's just a big old instant pot in a sense, and it's gonna pressure cook and sterilize anything that you put in there. So those blocks that you see on the far left go into that system there on like trolleys, and they would get wheeled in, and then you'd be able to pretty much cook and sterilize. We call it a cook, but you're sterilizing the media. And then on the other side, so the side you're looking at now currently is actually a dirty end, but on the other end of that is a clean end where, HEPA filters in a lab would be. So you would ideally, they'd go through it and then come out on the clean side. The last photo here is just, when we did what was it? The Bell Museum is what it was. We did some just presenting there of some of the research we were working on at the time. Which, if you guys were there, we had some wrinkled peach mushrooms that were pretty cool, and also some crown tip coral that were both local genetics we found and cultivated. Which I don't think here the wrinkled peach is actually like necessarily endangered, but I know in Europe it is, and it's really interesting. I've seen people in China also cultivate like thousands and thousands of pounds of it. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Here is actually that picture as well with there's a wild species of what the wrinkled peach look like outdoors. They actually had coincidentally found one that day. And then sorry, actually, I think my thing's on the wrong side. This is the this is the cultivated one, the one that lacks the pigment. It was grown kind of in a neglect kind of way, so it makes sense. But this is what it would look like if it was outdoors. So it being outdoors, it's exposed to a lot more temperature. It grows slower, so the melanin doesn't stretch as much. When you grow it indoors and you grow it at a high temperature, they tend to do weird things, and that goes for all mushrooms, especially like blue oysters. So it's kind of why if you've seen them look really nice and vibrant blue when they're young, as they get older, they stretch and turn somewhat gray. But same kind of concept here. There was a conference we were doing, another little education thing of like some at-home cultivation. I was showing people, the good old instant pot methods you can do, which is some of the most accessible methods of cultivation. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's really simple. You're pretty much just using an instant pot as a pressure cooker and a little tote that you carve some hand holes in, and then you can pretty much, work cleanly. You don't need a full HEPA filter. You can just pretty much have your hands right through there, and then it minimizes all the contaminants from blowing around in the air. And then here's a picture of me and Bob on the side here at the Bell Museum as well. He is doing a lot of the isolating, or not the isolating. I'm doing the isolating, but he's sequencing all the DNA for me pretty much. And then we're able to tell sometimes what some of these weird species are that we're able to find in the wild locally here. Also, I'll find stuff that is found, like someone will send me stuff from California or wherever, So like I've worked on a few different projects. There was one that is called the beefsteak. If you're familiar with it, it's called Fistulina hepatica. That was one that I was really, really invested a lot in for a while, and it's really cool. I think I have a picture right here. Yeah. So if you look on the far right here, there's 4 distinct patterns of growth. So on the top here, you'll see kind of like it just started when it was cut open. This is about maybe a week or so, a little bit beyond that. This is like a week and a half to 2 weeks in, and then this is about 3 weeks. So each step there, I've kind of been documenting and trying to collect data on because growing this mushroom is extremely sensitive and it's not one of the more I would put it up there with shiitake, maitake as some of the harder to grow species consistently. One of that being that it just the see these primordial blobs that form here. If you touch them as you open the bag, they will abort. And if you like look at them wrong or like do anything wrong, they'll abort and they just won't grow. So you really just pretty much open the bag, you cross your fingers and hope for the best. They've grown in higher humidity from what I've seen. Normally they grow with like this like weird pellicle of like jelly on it. And that was what I always like dreamt of cultivating and like having I could collect the jelly and put the jelly in jars and sell the jelly. But that's just a dream of mine. We got other mushrooms that I'm working on as well too. For the longest time, I thought this was actually Pleurotus laevis, the veiled oyster, and it's I guess been replaced in Lentinius, which makes it closer to shiitake if you're unfamiliar with the genus names. So it going from being placed in oyster to shiitake was pretty odd. But yeah, we did have a story about this one as well that we actually were cultivating a bit of this and for some reason, the stems are really, really fibrous and similar to shiitake almost, where they're really fibrous. But the stems actually, so the first day we ate all of it, but we only ate caps. And none of us out of four of us got sick. The second day we ate the whole thing, and three out of four of us got sick within like an hour of eating it. They were really good though. We actually called them Parmesan caps because they tasted and had this flavor of cheese. It was so weird and unique for a mushroom. But they also, when you cut them or damage them, they have um, a yellow bruising to them, which is kind of unique. But yeah, again, these native mushrooms here, so I'm trying to grow things that are local. You can grow this, it being closely related to a shiitake, which is something I noticed. It was odd that I grew these outdoors, and normally with oysters, if you've grown any oysters outdoors, you know these orange little beetles will attack any oysters you grow outdoors. And yeah, for some reason, these didn't get attacked by it, which made me kind of think it was weird to begin with. I was like, why is this an oyster? Every oyster I've ever cultivated and put outside has gotten attacked by these beetles, but yeah, this one never got attacked by them. I was like, I'm onto something here. Let's cultivate these. They're really good. And then it turns out, yeah, it's not even an oyster. In the bottom here, we got this lion's mane. This is a also known as crown tip coral, not necessarily lion's mane. It's the local variety, Hericium coralloides. This one's really cool. I'm thinking it has probably still some of those nootropic benefits that lion's mane is known to have as well. But really, I haven't done the research and analysis on it, but I'm hopefully connecting with some more people, and that kind of goes into some of the research I'm working on to try to find out if that is true or not. You know, there's actually quite a few different Hericium species. And you know, it's like Pokemon. I'm trying to catch them all. So, I got that one, and then this other one here on the side is Enoki. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Enoki. So Enoki is a really good one. This is also a native variety that I found, and yeah, I thought that was really cool. So I was like, you know, try to cultivate these native stuff and inspire other people to grow these native things. So there's things like the yellow oyster that people are probably pretty familiar with, and it's just it causes havoc on our environment. So I wouldn't recommend cultivating it. A lot of what happens is when unless you're really good at composting, usually people tend to just throw these blocks outside or just wherever, and then they tend to spread into the environment somehow. And it seems like they've been kind of slowly creeping from Wisconsin over this way. So I try personally to inspire and influence other people to cultivate native things that are already here. So we're not, you know, potentially bringing things from another place to another place. But yeah, that's a bit about me, and I also explore a little bit of the extraction side of things. So I extract mushrooms, make like tinctures and powders and that sort of thing as well. Um, Still in its infancy as far as my understanding goes. We still have a lot of work to figure out and learn more about what these mushrooms and their compounds do and how to differentiate them and the genetics that make them better or worse, and comparing them to wild and cultivated as well. The thing I guess I would say about that is with cultivated stuff, things tend to be a little bit more controlled, whereas the wild can be a free for all and you never really know what's out there, especially with stuff recently. All right, so we're gonna get into like the cycle of cultivation here. First off, everything always is gonna start with mushroom tissues, like the tissue itself from the mushroom or like the spores. So you can't start any of this or cultivate anything without one of the two. Once you get to the end of the cycle where you grow the mushrooms, you're gonna have to start back over at the beginning again. So no matter what part of this, you're gonna keep going through the cycle regardless. Um, but with mushroom tissue, you would pretty much take the center of a piece of mushroom, crack it open in half. Usually the center is, for the most part, the cleanest, and you would take a piece of that tissue and germinate it onto a nutrient gel, like a petri plate with agar and some sort of sugar. Um, and then for the spores, it's the same kind of thing. You would go about the same method. So once you have one of those germinated or the tissue is growing again, so let's just say I took a piece of mushroom from the wild that I thought was really cool, like the crown tip coral, for instance. I would take that, bring it to my lab, and take a piece of it. I would clean it up, try to spray it with some ISO or something, and then put it on my plate and hope for the best. And if the stars and the sun and everything aligns correctly, it works and it grows mycelium, and then I can isolate it further and then have a clean, isolated petri dish of just that mushroom. So you wouldn't have a bunch of other things living in there. So you wouldn't, get surprised and say grow in lion's mane when you have an oyster or something. But yeah, so once you have the tissue and the spores germinated, you're onto the isolating part. So sometimes when you do germinate them or have them, they're still dirty and have bacteria or yeast or something living with them or on them. And you need to separate the two in order to have success with any of this process. If you have anything that's living on your spores or your mycelium or anything, it makes it really difficult to have success no matter where you go in this whole cycle here. But yeah, so let's just say you now have an isolated petri dish. It has no contaminants on it from what you can tell. Everything seems to be clean. At this point, you're going to be making a liquid culture. And the liquid culture is what we're going to be talking about for the most part today. And what a lot of these scaling techniques that I help people with is going to reflect around making liquid culture and using this to go to bulk and scale up. So once you have your liquid culture, you're inoculating your mycelium into this liquid, which I'll have more slides here soon, and you'll see more about what all this is. But you'll have a liquid, and in this liquid, it's pretty much on a petri dish. It's 2D, where you only have one plane of mycelium growing. Where it goes into a liquid, it becomes 3D. And at that point, you have the most surface area that you really can have as a liquid. So at that point, you could either take, normally people will sometimes take and use Petri plates and go straight in to make grain spawn. But what a lot I do and a lot of other people do as well now is using this liquid culture and taking that and making grain spawn, because you can pretty much have a little bit go a long ways in a sense. We'll go into a lot more deeper on that, but I want you guys to understand the full cultivation cycle before we get into the details of all that. So once you have grain spawn, and grain spawn is pretty much just any grain you can think of, but it's cooked and has a certain hydration. you'll add this liquid to this grain, and then the mushroom mycelium will slowly take over the grain. It's really important to have your hydration levels and everything correct during this part of the process. Um, that's kind of like a big part of where people will mess up if they do mess up in any of this process is either the liquid culture step or the grain spawn step. These are the two most sensitive aspects of all of cultivation. But let's just say now you got a successful liquid culture. You put your successful liquid culture into and made your grain spawn. Once you now have successful grain spawn, it's fully colonized. This process takes, a couple weeks to get from one to the next to the other. So, if you're going to germinate the spores, it might take a week to 3 weeks to get your mycelium germinated. And if it's dirty or not, that might take another couple weeks to clean up. And then if you have a liquid culture, this could take another week or so. Um, so each step kind of takes a week to 2 weeks, roughly, depending on, you're pretty much taking a small amount of mycelium and slowly making it bigger each time here. So um, once you have the grain spawn here, at that point you'll start going into the colonized. You'll add that colonized grain to the substrate, and the substrate can vary from depending on what mushroom you're growing. So some mushrooms don't require a lot of nutrients. Other mushrooms want a lot of nutrients. So it just depends on what you're cultivating, and also if it's a white rot or brown rot, is you need to pay attention to kind of some of these things and how they break down these medias. But okay, so now you have your colonized grain in your pasteurized or sterilized substrate, and at that point, you're going to pretty much fruit your mushrooms. That's when you're getting these grow kits. This grow kit on the bag or on the block right here that goes into your grow room, and then you'll fruit mushrooms like I'm sure a lot of you have seen in the past. But yeah, pretty much everyone sells these ready to fruit kits and does this part, and fruits all that. But at any point in the cycle, as soon as you're done and completed this, to start over again, you gotta either have a bunch of liquid culture made, like this jar up here, or you gotta go all the way to the beginning again and go through the whole cycle again. Uh, Ideally, you would have a clean mushroom isolate here and keep those on hand, which actually I'll pass around these right now. Um, yeah. So a little bit about what I'm passing around is these are Petri plates. These are like living genetics from around the forest pretty much. So we find different things. A lot of those are a little bit older, so they're actually fruiting on the Petri plate, which is unique. I wouldn't recommend using it that old. But the thing is what you're doing here is once you have that clean isolate, you would store it. So there's these tubes that are coming around. Oh yeah. So here's one petri dish. So let's just say you have a petri dish, and you want to take this and store it for a long term. Oh, perfect. So here's a slant. So this slant here has a wood piece in it, and that wood piece pretty much acts as a long-term storage. And this is how you would store your genetics, most part for a long term. There's a few different methods, but this is just so you can understand. Once you get something germinated, spore germinated, and have the genetics of your dreams, once they're germinated, you would store them in one of these tubes like this, and then at that point, you could pull from the tube and then make more petri dishes. So it's what they call it is considered having a mother. So you're always going back to the mother and pulling from the earliest set of divisions in that cell lineage. So now, once you had one of these, you could have 5 of these petri dishes that are all your mothers, and then you could have those transferred out into making more of these petri dishes, and then the cycle continues, and then you're kind of almost starting from 2 and going to 6 each time. So yeah, that's a little bit about the storage and what you would need. So now we're going to get into a little bit about liquid culture and what it is. So liquid culture is mainly, you got water, obviously, but your main backbone of a lot of this is going to be sugar. So, that could vary from simple sugars to complex sugars. The simple sugars act as more of a really quick uh, thing to break down for it to have very aggressive growth right away, whereas these complex sugars act more as long-term, slower release over time, where it takes a little bit more energy for them to break it down. But I like to blend the two usually, honestly, to have a little bit of both. So then you have a lot of, a good start, but then also if you plan on storing a liquid a little bit longer than you initially planned, you got some extra nutrients in there for afterwards. But also some of these complex sugars usually tend to come with some other extra minerals as well too, which is never bad in the sense of liquid. So the reason that liquid culture is so sensitive is because, like you see here, it has a lot of nutrients in it. When you're doing some of these at-home methods, a lot of these methods kind of lean towards a very uh, nutrient deficient type of method where you're not using a high amount of nutrients. Where when you're using liquid, you almost need to have a laboratory or some sort of sterile procedure that you can use to really make this efficient. Otherwise, with all of these nutrients in here, you're inviting a lot of competition. So, you pretty much are depending on your pressure cooker to sterilize this nutrient, and then your HEPA filters to not really go beyond that. Um, but yeah, so we got sugar here. That's your main thing. You really can't do anything without sugar. If you have no sugar in there, it's really not going to take off at all. So that's like your step one. You could do sugar and just water, and that's fine for your recipe if that's what you wanted, but that wouldn't be like a complete necessarily recipe. Usually the next part would be the nitrogen. So you use a few different types of nitrogen. You can get it organic or inorganic. I would say a majority of people don't really use the inorganic as much. It's a little bit uh, spendier from what I've seen, at least from some of the websites I've used. But I usually stick with soy peptone. That's what I like. But really, you can use anything. But yeah, you pretty much need these two, sugar and nitrogen, to really have anything be worthwhile. Anything beyond that can be considered extra, I guess, if you want to go with the bare bones. But really, I have a recipe, what I consider here on the next slide, as to what those bare bones really are. But yeah, after that, you got your water. I usually suggest everybody does, distilled water because you're starting with a very neutral pH. There's not going to be contaminants in your water, and there's not other things in there. You're not going to have other minerals reacting with other things. If you're trying to do this, the idea is to keep as many variables consistent as possible. So when you scale it, things don't change. Um, but yeah, that's why I'd say use distilled water. It's not a requirement. You can get by with tap water, but it's better to use distilled. So for buffer agents, um, there's a lot of different things you can use. I tend to use calcium carbonate, but really what these are used for the most part, is more so that as the mushroom breaks down any substrate or anything in general, it tends to create a more acidic environment. So what this is, it's stabilizing that from escalating further for it to almost impact itself. So I recommend using about a 1%, depending on what you're using. If it's a liquid, you can maybe get away with a little bit less. I really don't use that much in liquid just because it tends to have issues with this spinner bar in there. There's a Teflon stir bar in there, and it can wear the Teflon out if you use too many of these um, minerals that don't fully dissolve into the solution. But yeah, you can use other things. Calcium carbonate is what I prefer, but really you could use lye, you could use whatever, as long as it's buffering your pH, I guess. Another thing would be is your supplementary minerals. So you got calcium sulfate, magnesium sulfate. You could use B vitamins, like you could use trace elements like zinc and some of these other weird ones. But not a lot of people do that sort of thing unless you're really getting interested in producing metabolites or enzymes in these reactors. What I'm doing with this here is not so much a commercial scale reactor. Those can get up to be like the same tanks that you would see in breweries. They'd be that size or bigger even sometimes. But then, yeah, so once you're getting into that and trying to produce some of those compounds where you're trying to produce a desired compound, you're going to want to use either some sort of amino acid that's going to act as a precursor for some of these compounds to actually. It's two things actually. It's going to be your genetics is a lot of it too. If your genetics aren't actually going to be powerful enough, or I don't know what the correct word would be, but your genetics have like the lock and key, and then these amino acids can be like that other aspect that can unlock its full potential, I guess. Um, so what is a bioreactor? Now, if you do you want to pass this big jug around? So the only thing I ask is try not to be too just don't touch the top bits. They can be kind of sensitive. You can pass it around, but just the top bits if they oh yeah, showing the thing here. So here's a big jug of it. I don't know, it's probably dark right here, but this is liquid culture. This is a bioreactor that I made. Uh, you guys will see in a second, but pretty much all it consists of is a way to mix what's in here. So there's a little stir bar in there. It's a Teflon stir bar that goes on a magnetic stir plate, and that can stir up what's in the solution here. But then you have a filter here, which is a gas exchange filter. So that's going to be able to release the gas that's building up in here because mushrooms are like us, where they breathe oxygen and release carbon dioxide. But this top piece here is actually going to be your air intake. So you're going to have with these bioreactors, what kind of takes them to the next level is adding air. So with these contraptions, you're able to uh, have and connect a little air line like an aquarium pump, for example. But that would put air through this filter and it would pretty much do a sterile filtration through this filter. So it's not going to let any contaminants through. So you're not like keeping this in front of a HEPA filter or like keeping this somewhere where it needs to be clean 24/7. I have it. You could do this wherever. You could do it right here. As long as you have these filters, it pretty much is the backbone of keeping what's in here clean. But then on this last little section, you'll have like a disconnecting. It's a little cap. You disconnect this cap and you can attach a syringe. You could attach some tubing line. So you could run it through a peristaltic pump and be able to actually run all your media that's in here out really quickly and dispense it fast. But yeah, I guess I missed this part, but there's a little one-way check valve here. Pretty much only allows the air to go in one way and not back out the other way. And yeah, so the air comes in one tube and then up and out this other one. So, but we'll explain a little bit more. I have some more little dissections of what these are. So yeah, but ideally on those you're able to like really optimize all these different levels as far as how much oxygen you can give it, the nutrient supply. You can really play with different nutrients, like giving it more sugar, less sugar, more nitrogen or less nitrogen. That's kind of what I'm up to in my lab a lot of the time is seeing the different results and how much faster I can make it grow or how much slower it takes to grow. But yeah, those a bioreactor is just a vessel. It's going to be able to keep what's in it growing sterile. It's easy to, I mean, obviously that's pretty small, so you can store them pretty easily, but you're also able to like connect monitors to them on the bigger systems. So if you were to say have a giant one that's the size of a beer tank or brewing tank, you could have all these, adjust and have a computer attached to it, so it pretty much stays at the perfect level the whole time. You wouldn't be having all these fluctuations, I guess. And when you get to that larger side, it starts getting a lot more confusing. Um, but yeah, so the bioreactor can go and it's beneficial for multiple reasons from, someone who it's really accessible. Like I made that myself and I sell these. So like people could, it's not going to be a barrier. You don't need to shovel out 100 grand or whatever to have this huge brewing tank, for your production. You could simply, make these lids or make them whatever size you want, and then, get these benefits that I'm talking about. So the materials required for all this are pretty, you can't really miss out on any of these pieces. If you don't have any of these pieces, a lot of this is going to be a lot more difficult. So the first photo here is just a pressure cooker. That's a bigger pressure cooker. Yours doesn't need to be this big. It could be smaller. It could be giant. But really, you need a pressure cooker to put these jars in there because they get sterilized. Your next requirement would be to have this jar. You would need the lid of the vessel itself and, you know, the nutrients that you're going to put inside of it. So after that, let's just say you put all of this in here and you have your jar completed. Now, when you pull your liquid out, the thing that you're going to want is that the steam can get in here. So you don't just seal these jars up and then put them in an autoclave. You're going to leave a little bit of space with this lid here. So you'll leave it cracked enough just so a little bit of that steam can get inside the jar, but you also don't want the jar to build pressure. So if it builds pressure, it's most likely going to break the jar or blow these gaskets all over the place or something. Something bad will happen. You don't want to find out. Um, but pretty much, yeah, let's say you got these in here. Once you put it in here, the lid is off. So as soon as you open this, what's in this pressure cooker is hot. So I'm assuming you're not living in a super hot environment where it's as hot as what is inside a pressure cooker when you open it. So as soon as you open this, all the cold air of what's around you is going to suck right inside of this and pretty much do a reverse vacuum into your mix. So contaminating your liquid. So I highly suggest if you're going to try to mess with liquid culture that you open these in front of a flow hood, which is your last requirement right here. So if you don't have a flow hood, I would say don't mess with liquid culture yet. Wait until you get a flow hood before you start messing with it because it's really going to throw a wrench in everything because the hard part about growing liquid culture is that if you do grow it out, seeing what's in there, you're not going to be able to tell with your eyes to be able to know if it's what you want it to be or not, or if you had some extra competitor hop in as well as you were inoculating it or taking it out of the pressure cooker or whatever. So yeah, these are your requirements. If you don't have these four things, you really can't do this at all. But these are kind of the backbone as far as if you are in cultivation at all, you probably have these already. So,
The question was she asked.
oh, I missed it.
Strong wood do you need?
I guess the thing is if you can the flow itself doesn't necessarily need to be that strong. If the flow is the main thing is that it's able to be set in front of the HEPA. So like these two things that you're seeing are actually like right next to each other. So like this is like right, the table is right here. So like as soon as I open this, this is here. So you want to have if you're using a little instant pot, as long as you can put your instant pot in front of your hood right here, it doesn't necessarily need a super strong flow. The flow is kind of more so just making sure that if you had something come from like up here and it's coming down, it's going to hit here and then go this way instead of like, or even your breath. Like if you're standing like right here, and you're breathing, well, you're breathing, it's preventing your breath from like going into your work. So that's like a big part of why things get contaminated is your mouth. But yeah, these are kind of your main things. You don't need a super powerful one. You don't need a two by four. You could get by with a one by one and have any size of any of these pieces. You could have a really small reactor with a really small autoclave with a really small flow hood, and still get all these benefits. It would probably be pretty cheap too, honestly, in comparison to how people are doing some of these other methods. But you really just need to know what you need in order to make some of this happen. So why use liquid culture and not just take a petri dish and put the petri dish in grain spawn, or use the petri dish in as my inoculation instead of a liquid? So the reason that I like it mainly is because, like I said, large or small farms, it's not really cost prohibitive. So if you have like if you can get mason jars, you're able to pretty much make liquid culture. It's that simple. You only need a couple of these small plastic pieces and the glass jar itself. But if you're a big farm, you could have a huge burr vat, if you wanted, and go to the moon. But then, yeah, you get faster colonization. So this jar here that you see, that takes this normally, if I put only I think I passed that jar around, but normally people don't put air and inject air into liquid. Air is a big part of what makes mushrooms grow. If you're putting, they're an aerobic organism. So if you try to make it an anaerobic organism, it doesn't do too well. So pretty much adding the air into this liquid makes it grow almost two times, if not three times faster than it ever would. But normally people will put like a little stir bar in here. This is on a stir plate here, if you can see that. But pretty much people would put the stir bar in here without the air. And if the air wasn't added, it would take you about a month, maybe 3 weeks or so to get something as full as you see in this picture here, which most people don't even get things that full and use it. They'll use it way less full. So I'm not saying you maybe need to get it that full, but when I do, it helps a lot and I can see the results. It is crazy, honestly. But yeah, you're able to do this for pretty cheap. It's really easy to store this. Like I could have like 50 of them, and that can expand to like hundreds of thousands of pounds of mushrooms. So like you really there's no end. You could like I could take that jar and make probably 30,000 pounds of mushrooms if I wanted. But that's not usually what I do. It's not very efficient to do it that way, but I usually go through a lot of it really quick, because once you understand how fast and quick you can do all this, you just make more of it quickly and keep going with the cycle, like this cycle of cultivation we saw earlier. Yeah, and it's versatile. If you want to start playing around with it, you can also, add more sugar, less sugar, add these other amino acids, more nitrogen, less nitrogen, all these different things. You can play with it to see if you get bigger yields in the end, if you get, if it changes anything. It's really interesting to see, when you add and subtract things. A lot of the times you can keep subtracting things, and people are overfeeding things a majority of the time. A lot of the standardized mixes are actually a bit too much. So with any medium that you're using, you really only need about 30%, 20 to 30% of whatever is in the total media to be nutrients. But yeah, it's pretty easy to dispense too. I can attach a syringe to the top of that. Like you remove that little cap on there, and then you just can attach the syringe right to it instead of having to take out a needle, put the needle on, inject the needle, and put that into another inject, and then flame sterilize the needle. That process doesn't work, especially I found out the hard way, honestly, because I was trying to do a lot and then started getting like carpal tunnel from pulling so much syringes all the time that I was like, we need to find a different method. So we ended up making these lids, and they're really popular in the mycology world. So now we've been scaling them up and trying to get them all across the country. So, but yeah, these are kind of the main reasons as why you're going to have faster colonization if you use it compared to anything else. It's really, really consistent. This is like the easiest thing to repeat on a bigger scale. So, when you're trying to do a bigger scale with like hundreds of thousands of petri dishes, someone's gonna like go home crying and not have a good time. So these are a little bit more of like dissecting what the reactor is. Reactors don't need to be this simple, but that's why these became so popular is because normally this concept is very expensive. Something that size could cost over $100, if you wanted to buy a lab grade one where it has borosilicate and like all these fancy bells and whistles, which is awesome if you can afford it. But I'd say 90% of people who cultivate can't. So yeah, this first thing is the lid here itself. Sometimes, you'll have a syringe port on the one I'm passing around. It doesn't. That's just because I have an air line going in. You can put the air line in this side here if you wanted to or not. It really, you just can make these lids however you want, really. But I find the easiest way is to take this big, it's the aerator attachment that I showed earlier, but it just has a filter on it, and that connects to this where you would also connect the syringe because you're pretty much not going to be aerating and pulling a syringe at the same time. So as soon as you're done with aeration step, you'll either put a cap on it and store it for a while, or you can put a syringe directly on it and use it. But yeah, again, this red thing here is a syringe filter. This is providing gas exchange. If you don't have this, your mushrooms probably aren't breathing and are choking. So don't do that. But yeah, this piece here in the middle is a check valve. This is not required. This is when you're making these, you have a long line of air in here. So if you're filling up a really small syringe, like a 10 mil syringe, and if you want to prevent it from filling with a bit of air, this little check valve will prevent that. And it's not something that's required by everyone, but yeah, you could use it. I had in the previous past used these grommets. They're like little silicone grommets. You can use that and thread the silicone through. Otherwise, they have plastic little bulkheads. They're all pretty cheap. You can use whatever you want to use. But yeah, that's kind of the basic gist of what you're using. This syringe port is only to test if you want to like either say you had a syringe, someone gave you a syringe and you knew it was clean and you just wanted to inject that right away into this big reactor, or not big, but you know what I mean. This reactor, you could put it right in there directly and then know it's clean. And then you could also test it afterwards if you wanted to. So then you don't need to risk contaminating this. Sometimes when you pull and go back and forth, you don't really want to like get to that step until you need to. So here's a basic recipe for liquid culture. It can get way more complex than this. You could probably even take away some things from this if you wanted to and get by with less. But this is what I consider from my personal experience to be like the base. And if you're not using at least this, you're going to have not the greatest results. But again, these first two things are sugars. So you got light malt extract, that's a complex sugar. You got dextrose, that's a simple sugar. The simple sugar is going to be a quicker thing to break down for the mycelium to jump off fast. Light malt extract is a little bit more of a longer term storage. So if I don't get to it in the first week or two, it'll be fine. Yeast extract and soy peptone are both going to be they have a little bit of amino acids in there, but they also supply a good amount of like the nitrogen and everything. So it's pretty important to not skimp out on that part of it if you want to get good yields. But it depends on what you're doing. If you're using liquid as spawn, or if you're using liquid to make grain, which we'll get into that step here in a second. But then these last two, you got calcium carbonate. That's a buffer, so that just kind of keeps my pH kind of where I want it during the colonization phase of the liquid culture. But then, yeah, calcium sulfate also it's another mineral that tends to help boost a little bit. I don't notice a huge difference with or without it. You could probably take it out if you wanted to, but it seems to help a little bit if you do add it in there. But a lot of things, as you keep adding more and more and more, it just makes the cultivation process more and more expensive. So that's why a lot of labs go out of business. Uh, it's not a cheap thing to be in. You gotta have gloves, isopropyl oil, you name it. It's a lot to keep up on. So liquid culture, the process here. So I'm gonna have a video here that will explain pretty much kind of a similar idea of what I'm doing. It'll be kind of a quick video, but ideally what's happening in this video is you're weighing out your nutrients into preferably a borosilicate glass so you can pour boiling water into it. Main thing about when you pour the water into this vessel is that if you don't um, pour boiling water and dissolve it, it's just not going to take off as quickly because it's pretty much just floating sediment in there versus being dissolved into the solution. And that just kind of helps. If you have these dissolved in there, it just takes off that much faster. It can still work if you don't do that method, but I suggest doing it if you can, especially with agar. If you have agar, it will separate your nutrients out too much. With liquid culture, you can get by, but with agar, you need to use this boiling method. Otherwise, you'll have all your nutrients sink to the bottom and then pour one juicy plate of agar at the bottom, and all the rest of it will be diluted. But then, yeah, pretty much all these fungi for the most part, not all of them, but a lot of the ones people cultivate prefer to be between 5.5 and 6.5 as far as pH goes. So whether you're making whatever you're making, it could be, a liquid culture, substrate, or agar, it could be whatever you want, but keep your pH on point. If it gets out of whack, weird things can happen. Then you got your sterilize. You're going to sterilize the whole bioreactor. So you'll put it in your cooker pretty much and sterilize the whole thing. That whole jar goes in there. The main thing to think about when you're doing this is just that you're covering your filters up and that they don't get wet. If your filters get wet, they're not going to be able to provide the gas exchange unless you use a hydrophilic versus a hydrophobic, which most people use hydrophobic. After, like I said, that part is pretty important to cook your when you cook the pressure when you pressure cook the vessel, it's important to open it in front of a hood and allow it to cool down in front of a hood. So like I said, if you don't, it can reverse vacuum. So you're gonna want at least like some sort of a clean flow in front of when you open that. Otherwise, let your pressure cooker come all the way down until you don't want to open it hot at that point if you have no HEPA filter. So let it come all the way down to where it's like room temp again, and then there won't be such a dynamic change for it to do this vacuum process. But yeah, cool it down. I usually just like leave them in front of the HEPA for overnight, make my liquid culture and then sit it there. And then the next morning I'll inoculate it. When you're inoculating these things, you can use a liquid to a liquid, or actually, here's the video. We'll show you the quick video. So you boil the water, spin it up, dissolve it. There's your filters, put them in a bag. That's me checking all the tops, make sure everything's on there. You want it nice and loose like that, like I said, so the steam can get in. Now it's going up to pressure. You're going to cook for 25 minutes at about 15 to 17 psi. And then as soon as you open it, seal those jars back up and set them in front of the hood. And at that point, they just cool down overnight. Like I said, you don't have to wait overnight, but as long as they're below 95 degrees, that's the most important. Anything above 95 degrees is almost always going to kill your fungus. So I think I already passed around the stuff, but yeah, pretty much to go from any of these to make a bioreactor or to use liquid culture and make liquid culture, you're going to either inoculate it with one of these things, whether it be a liquid culture that's already active that you stored in a syringe from earlier or you got from someone else or something. So if you had one already that's clean, you can just put that straight in, and that's always going to be the fastest. If you're taking your liquid and going from a petri dish in, there's usually a recovery time that occurs during this part. So there's just a lot more. Like I said, it's a two from petri dish, you have a 2D plane. With liquid culture, you have a 3D plane. So you're putting a lot more mycelium itself in with liquid. So I always recommend people go liquid to liquid if possible. But at some point, you will need to almost have a similar process as to what I was saying before, where you have mother jars of liquid culture that you pull from, kind of like the slant thing that I was talking about earlier for long-term storage of your genetics. You'll have your liquid that you'll expand. You'll have one jar that's like, say, a 32-ounce jar that you expand into bigger jars, like half-gallon jars. So, yeah, like I said, the if you wanted to do with a petri dish instead, you could, and usually this is required at least at some point, to make these mother culture jars. And the way you would do that is just you pretty much cut up, use a sterile scalpel and cut up a few of these pieces and add it. You'd open this all in front of a flow hood, obviously, and add these pieces of agar in there. If you have too much like that tube in there, if you have too big a chunks of agar that go in there, it's going to clog your tubing up. So I suggest to keep it kind of small for the most part, nice small cuts. The last one here is spores to liquid. So a lot of people always have probably heard spores or can I use spores or inoculate with spores. I almost always don't recommend this because 9 times out of 10 or almost 11 times out of 10, it's like always contaminated. So to take a clean mushroom spore print requires you to grow the mushroom itself sterilely. And I don't think a lot of people understand that part. So like obtaining a clean sterile spore print, let alone doing the process and making this part sterile as well to put it into a sterile solution is just not very likely. A lot of vendors aren't, doing this process very cleanly. So eventually you end up getting a syringe that has a bunch of other things growing in it as well, not just the spores. So I don't recommend you take spores and go straight into a high nutrient liquid because you're probably going to have a lot of other competitors take off and be a lot more aggressive than the mushroom that you're putting into the solution. So I recommend take spores, germinate them onto a petri dish. Once you have mycelium, it doesn't need to be the perfect mycelium. Like it doesn't need to be like the best genetics you've ever had, but at least get it to that point so you can make liquid culture and go on from there. Otherwise, you're just gonna waste a lot of time and wish you never did that because you got everything you made contaminated or. But yeah, just do it the right way first. It works. If you do it, it's tried and true. Here's a little bit about aeration. So aerating is, yeah, like I said, I feel like I kind of already explained this a little bit already, but it's taking the filters that you see on top. Those filters are a 0.2 micron size filter, so it's in a sense not allowing anything small, bigger than that to get in. So a majority of contaminants are zero point 0.2 and bigger. So a majority of these things don't get through. That's why you're able to take pretty much dirty air and run it through a airline and then go through those filters and it to be clean on the inside of the jar. But then, yeah, again, with this, you're going to need an exit for that air. You can't just pressurize a jar and have the air not go anywhere. So it needs an exit as well. So yeah, after that, you're gonna pretty much the main thing with aeration and why it's superior to anything is because fungus require oxygen. Like they have to have oxygen in order to grow faster. The more you deplete them of oxygen, the slower and more weird things happen. Most likely things like from not being able to fruit or fruiting really, really weird fruit that don't look correct. They usually tend to grow really stemmy, where it's just a lot of the stem and no cap. But yeah, there's a lot of different things as to what air can do. So, especially in nature, I mean, you guys see mushrooms growing outside, they're not depleted of air whatsoever. So, it's pretty important in any of it. So, when you take things into a lab, it's kind of why it's pretty important. It really takes off, as well as, let's just say I took one of those jars, the aerated jars, and another jar that wasn't aerated. The aerated jar, if I were to inoculate the same thing and everything were to be the same, the aerated jar will have growth within 24 hours. Like, you'll be able to look at the grain or whatever you inoculated and see that you have growth in 24 hours, or at least 48, whereas some of the other ones take a little bit longer than that. And yeah, it's pretty crucial when, this whole process is very time sensitive. Um, so this photo here is a lion's mane petri dish. But yeah, pretty much the main thing is that all these take only about 8 days, depending on if you're doing lion's mane, oysters. Shiitake is a weird one. I wouldn't call shiitake in the group with that, but for the most part, all the ones that aren't that difficult to cultivate all are on the same time frame as far as how long they take, which is about 8 days from the beginning of nothing in there, and I inoculated it to that jar you see that I passed around, and it's full. Pretty much anything beyond that point is going to get so thick that I can't pull it out of the jar anymore, and I'd have to like pour it out. That is, yeah, me and some of my friends were jamming out in the lab. So yeah, here's some of what I offer as Myco-Op. So I offer sterilized substrates, wood-based substrates, coconut substrates if you need, any of these things sterilized. I have my own pressure cooker. I, cook a bunch of stuff all the time and have a pretty reliable, accurate sterilization process. So I'm confident enough that I pretty much guarantee that you will have it. And if it's not, I'll refund you or get you another one. Genetics, I offer a pretty large variety of genetics. It's kind of a bit much to keep track of all the time just because I have so many. But yeah, I pretty much am constantly, transferring out new ones, trying out new ones that I haven't seen cultivated yet. And yeah, but some of the ones that are, successful and that I find to be worthy to go on to, be grown by all these magnificent cultivators out there, I offer them, as well. So I have liquid culture syringes, I have petri plates, I have, yeah, you name it. I can get you spores if you really want, but I usually don't do the spore thing. Consultations is kind of like a big part of what I'm doing currently as far as just helping people scale their business. So whether you're, a hobby grower and are just trying to learn a little bit, or if you're a big bulk grower and are trying to grow hundreds of thousands of pounds, all the things I can do and help you, will be able to take your farm to the next level and pretty much save you tons and tons of money. I can guarantee it. I also do the ready to grow fruit or ready to fruit grow kits. You can contact me on social media or email or anything like that, and you can see what we have in store. Sometimes in the different seasons, I'll have different things. So, like if it's wintertime, I'll do Enoki's, or Maitakis. But yeah, it just depends on the season. I'll have different things around different times of the year. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can contact me. I don't have any business cards or anything, so if you want, please take a picture of this and you can get a hold of me at my email, or if you want my phone number, you can come get my phone number by, at the end here. But yeah, if there's any questions, I'd like to open the floor up for questions so we can get some answers out there. Oh, we got a mic for you, actually.
Thanks for having the mic. Why did the mic? You also sell the bioreactors?
Yeah, that's a big part of what I do. I sell them in a lot of different sizes. Have like 30, like little small 32-ounce sizes. I have 16-ounce sizes. I have like 20-liter sizes. So It just depends on your needs. If you're, someone who's just trying to grow a little bit of mushrooms, we can get you covered. If you're trying to grow a lot of mushrooms, we can get you covered. So, yeah.
I have two questions. First is, how long does this last? If you just keep aerating this, it'll go forever or what?
If I keep aerating it, the liquid will disappear and it'll just be a mat of mushroom mycelium. And then you, after about a month, won't be able to see any more liquid and it'll just be a thick scoby.
Then you see more from mother.
Yeah. So pretty much beyond that point that you see there, I wouldn't go much further just because one, I can't suck it out at that point and I would have to just dump it out, which probably wouldn't be the end of the world, but it's a lot more sterile if I do it with the sterile syringe and, guide it in. But yeah, you could store it. I'd say if it was in the refrigerator, you could store it for a couple months maybe. But the thing with the aerated liquid culture versus non-aerated is that the aerated you want to use quickly because it gets so thick. Really, that you have like a window. There's a kind of a window as soon as you take it off the air, the next 2 weeks, it's going to keep duplicating for the next 2 weeks. But at the end of that next 2 weeks, it's going to start coming down. So what fungus need in order to continue growing is nutrients and air. And if one of those two start depleting, the way they replicate starts to die down faster. So that would be.
I have a question was the substrate use. You have different substrates based on like white butter or brown butter.
Yeah. Yeah. So that one that I showed you, the beefsteak, is actually a brown rot. And I haven't seen anyone else grow brown rot before, honestly. So I thought it was pretty unique when I did it. And I don't know, it's another mushroom you can eat raw from what I hear as well. So I thought that was cool. Tastes kind of lemony in a way.
My plants on like little tubes, like little glass 15 ml tubes. And you have this funky huge glass tissue culture tube. And I'm wondering, like, is that just for fun? Does that have a function?
Oh, so that big one, yeah, maybe I can show it. I don't think I showed it to the screen here. So I have it. She's talking about an armillaria mushroom. So this is an armillaria. It's a bioluminescent fungus, but it grows with these huge rhizomorphs that go 3D. You can see this in the wild. If you were to find a honey mushroom outside, you'd see the same thing and find these. Usually the rhizomorphs turn black and are like these long, thick rope looking things, but you definitely don't need it to be this big. The reason I made it is because I wanted to be able to have a visualization for people to see it. Because this is actually, I've been growing this in here for a little over 2 months. And I thought it was going to be like to the bottom because it's like really nutrient rich. And I was like, oh, it's going to go quick, but it's been really slow and just kind of slowly grinding away. So I thought it'd be cool to like hopefully like light it up at the base with something and then like have it as like a little light. And then you'd see all the, crazy rhizomorphs. But the next one I'm gonna make is gonna be clear, so then you'll be able to see it a little bit better. But yeah, I don't know if you guys can see it on the camera, but it's just pretty much looks like plant roots in a bunch of agar. Massive slant.
There's a question in the Zoom about the stir bar and the liquid culture.
Mhm.
And does the liquid need constant stirring, or is that just at a certain phase?
So there's two things. The air, actually, so the picture where I showed the bobas, like that, people always ask me about these bobas, and that's kind of where this frog guy came from, is we make these little frog eggs. But so what creates these little balls and spheres is because of how much air pressure I'm putting into the jar. So it kind of like cycles in there and creates these little spheres. But if I were to not do that and then also use the spinner bar, I kind of do this just because it looks cool and people want to see that and it makes people like, whoa, but that's not necessarily like what you want. You want to like stir it up to where it's thin and really small to where it's just like a bunch of stuff because you're losing surface area as these get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's just like a you get less and less surface area that way. So you want it to be really, really thin, really small. Ideally, in the first 3 days, you would mix it up as you aerate it. But pretty much on the 8 days that I'm talking about, it's a 24/7 aeration through that whole time period. And I only pop it on the stir plate for maybe like 30 seconds on the first 3 days because if you inoculate, it depends on if you're inoculating with agar. If you inoculate with agar, then you're going to want to like shred those agar bits up and get them small. But if it's liquid to liquid, usually it's already pretty small and it just takes off right away and you don't even need to mix it. So, yeah.
Yeah, Courtney, on one of your first slides, I think you had something like a veiled oyster.
Oh, yeah.
What species that was that?
It used
Or
when I
Pleurotus drainus and,
it was in Pleurotus. It's been
so it has, it's now.
It's now in Lentinius. So there was like I posted about this and so I'm on Red Note, which is like a Chinese version of Instagram, and I posted it, and some Chinese cultivator was like, "Oh yeah, no, this is definitely Lentinius now," and I was like, "What?" And yeah, no, I've been calling it Pleurotus this whole time, and he's like, "No, it's changed a long time ago," and I was like, didn't catch the memo, I guess.
Correct to lentils.
Yeah, no, I mean,
It used to be called Pleurotus laevis. So it was in the oyster genus. So it switched from being in an oyster genus to the shiitake genus,
Oh,
which is a weird. That's not anything you'd probably confuse.
that's not something you want to.
No, you do.
Yeah.
It tastes good. I've eaten it.
You said that stems.
So that's the thing. Yeah, that's the. I don't think you could get me to eat it again because I was one of those three. But it was really good, and I highly suggest other people to eat it. But I just wouldn't eat the stem. Like cut the stem off because it's so fibrous that it's just not good. But I'm telling you, cheese caps, like we used to call them Parmesan caps because they were like so cheesy. It was weird.
They get much bigger than that because we found a whole bunch of those down at Landgrove in the fall.
This is a deceiving photo. This is like a pretty big cluster, actually. It's like bigger than, it's like this big, probably.
So there used to be Pleurotus drainus and Pleurotus laevis.
Yes.
It was in Pleurotus laevis. Yeah, so this one was in laevis. From what I understand, the laevis is one that bruises yellow, but the dryness doesn't. And I think the dryness doesn't grow in Minnesota, if I'm right. I could be wrong. I don't know. But anyway, the laevis, I had actually Bob test the sequence. He sequenced it for me. So it actually first came back as dryness, and I was calling it Pleurotus dryness for a long time. But then I looked at the sequence again recently, and that Chinese guy was right. It's in Lentinius. So yeah, I don't know what to call anything. I just go by the common names, and that's usually easy enough for me right now. But it just seems like they update things all the time, and it's kind of difficult to keep up with all of them. But yeah, they're all good as long as I can eat them. That's all I care about.
Yeah,
Are there any other
I wanted to
questions?
ask, about the ideal pH, because it used to be that, like, treating a substrate, you put a bunch of calcium hydroxide and you get up to about a pH of 12 and you put stuff in there and it would grow.
So with the process that you're talking about, usually with that pH, you would add this, I forget what it is, but there's like a crystal that you'll add afterwards that will neutralize the pH. And what you're doing with that process is like pH pasteurization. And I used to work at a facility that was designed for that, but it pretty much raises the pH for to kill off all competition. Then once it's killed off, you add that I'm forgetting what it is, but it just neutralizes everything back down to 7. And then at that point, you could inoculate, you pull it out from the solution because it's like soaking in a bunch of this super high pH. But yeah, then you bag it and it neutralizes itself, and then you're ready to go. It pretty much is always taking off. If you get stuff that's growing above that, you're getting into some weird fungus. There are stuff that will do it, but I don't feel like it's as common, at least with the stuff that we eat, or the specialty mushrooms we eat.
I was wondering, it seems like you have done a lot of research in a lot of different areas around this. And so what are you like most excited about in research right now?
If I had more funding, I probably would get some like big brewer vats and try to grow like a bunch of mycelium in a sense. A lot of people talk down on mycelium versus fruiting body when it comes to like the medicinal compounds of stuff. But really, it's just like a lack of understanding in how you can separate some of these compounds out. You can grow mycelium in liquid culture and then pretty much separate out everything and have just pure mycelium, and then you'd have no grain. And that's usually why people always are hating on the mycelium on grain. There are different metabolites that can be made by mycelium on grain, but what I find to be really interesting is having huge reactors and being able to either use those reactors to grow a bunch of mushroom bags like this mushroom bag here, or trying to be able to take what I'm growing in there and then extract it and then process it further into a bioavailable supplement, I guess. That's what I like, but also just growing new mushrooms. If I can go to the woods and spend more time in the woods, it wouldn't pay me to do this, but if I could spend a lot of time in the woods to just go there, find weird mushrooms and take them to the lab and cultivate them, I'd probably just do that. But yeah, I gotta pay the bills somehow. Yeah.
Bob and I were talking about this a little bit before the meeting, and there's a mushroom that people who die would like to use, and it's a really hard one to find. Oh, Bob, you found one last year that had a lot less vigilance,
Oh,
and it seems like it's a wood router. And so of course I'm thinking,
Yeah.
if you found one, could you grow a culture and make like sawdust stuff spawn?
oh yeah,
and,
easy.
like trees?
If you find something, yeah, on wood. Yeah, if you find one on wood or if you find anything that you find interesting on wood, it almost always is cultivatable. Because anything that grows on wood, like the different levels of like things, so like if you have mycorrhizal fungi, those are almost the only ones that become really, you can cultivate them, but they're extremely difficult. And I wouldn't say try it unless you're pretty experienced with growing like oysters and other things first. But yeah, you have your mycorrhizal stuff that really requires a really sophisticated relationship, but then you have your parasitic stuff, which can sometimes be pretty easy to cultivate, not always, but sometimes. Like a cordyceps is a parasite, so you can cultivate that pretty easily. But then there's your saprophytic, and then these saprophytic mushrooms are gonna always just be breaking down wood and decomposing whatever matter. So sometimes that means you can get creative with what you want to feed that thing, or they'll react different to this substrate or that substrate. So like if it's a white rot or brown rot too, that can play a role in it. So it gets to be like you gotta dissect it. I go into the woods and I'll find these mushrooms and I'll be like, oh wow, this mushroom like with the beefsteak, for instance, it took me such a long time to be able to take that mushroom and then realize that it wouldn't grow on all these other substrates as easy because it was a brown rot. I would just thought initially right away, I'm like, it grows on wood. It's gonna just grow on everything that everything else grows on. It should be easy enough, right? But I started diving into it. I was like, well, what does brown rot like to eat? Well, they like cellulose more, so you're gonna have to try to use a little bit more, get a little more creative with like your substrate recipes. So, that kind of comes into it, as well as like the nutritional profiles. If you have like too low of nutrients or too high, some things really want a high nutrient if It just depends when you see them in the woods. If you see them decomposing like a fresh living tree versus a really old tree, try to write that down, keep that in your head as you're going towards your experiments. But um, yeah, I don't know. I'm always curious with when I find stuff on wood that I haven't seen people cultivated, I almost always take it to the lab because I'm curious about it.
But you would need it fresh.
Really fresh.
Or a spore print.
It usually is the easiest for me to get into culture if it is fresh. If it's dried, it's kind of hit or miss. It depends on how long it's been dried, um, and what type of drying. If it was freeze dried or really hot heat dried. If it was a low heat dry, it'd probably be better, but it just depends, you know. A lot of the time, I would say the best way would be to either take a spore print because you could take it from a spore print and I can isolate things from spore prints really well. Or yeah, the fresh mushroom, like get it within a few days and then like I said, you kind of crack it open. You want a big enough piece to where you can take a part of the middle of it. So you want to be able to break it in half. And so like something like a turkey tail is incredibly difficult. You know, trying to take a little piece of the inside of a turkey tail, it's not fun. You're playing a game of doctor in there and it doesn't work. So when it comes to that sort of thing, you need to start playing with like antibiotics and other additives to try to do that, or even low nutrient. Like again, either you're playing with high nutrients and a lot of things germinate, or you play with low nutrients and fungus still germinates, but usually it tends to weed out competition. So either you play with that pH or you play with the nutrient profile.
A question is, says, what are you looking to isolate on the agar plates? And what do good genetics look like?
That's a tricky question because each mushroom mycelium looks a little different. So if you're looking at a shiitake, for instance, or a lion's mane, they're extremely wispy and really like thin to where you can almost hardly tell they're there. But if you have like an oyster, it's so aggressive and so um like it grows like to the whole petri plate like in a few days, where some of these other ones don't grow that fast. So it could take like a month on some of the weird ones. So it depends, you know, if you have a familiarity with that mushroom specifically, you'll kind of have some key traits you're probably looking for, as far as like, oh, uh is it producing denser, really thick, dense mycelium, or is it like spreading itself very far and really thin quickly? Like sometimes those two different things can be a really big differentiator on how they actually fruit. Because sometimes they can fruit way faster if they, you know, colonize something quicker, but you know, other times not, you know, so it just depends on the mushroom because you always want it to be thicker and denser. If you can get it thicker and denser, really thin, wispy mycelium is usually tends to be really weak and temperature sensitive and humidity sensitive. So if these things get too dry, they'll just die and shrivel out. So then you would need a spore to regerminate at that point and go on.
Yeah, Courtney, I just, one of your petri dishes had Larry growing on it, even fruiting on there, which I thought was amazing.
Yeah, that one's cool.
So how did you, start that from spores or tissue?
Yeah, that was growing on this buckthorn in my backyard, and I thought it was really interesting. So I was like, huh, wonder what this could be used for. So I was playing around with it. Yeah. But there's a lot of weird stuff, you know. If you see weird stuff, I always suggest, you know, try to see what you can do with it, you know. You'll never know. So I just did Blue It just the other day. That was a cool one. Um, what else have I done? Well, you guys know the crown tip coral. That's one I've been working on for a while. Um, I don't know. I try to isolate a bunch of weirdos. So like the other day, and it's not always successful. That's the thing. And it takes a long time for me to find out if I'm successful or not. So like this one I did recently was Polypocladium ophioglossaides. And I was hoping that I got it because I took one of these, it's like it grows on this truffle, scleroderma.
Oh,
And it looks like a cordyceps. So I was like, oh, that'd be a cool one to grow, you know. And I've seen one of my friends grow it before, so I was like, ah, that'd be an awesome one to try out. But yeah, that one, then it just when you try to cultivate some of these weirdos like that, if you don't have like antibiotics or some of these other like protocols in hand, you can just germinate a bunch of garbage. And I do that sometimes. So uh, it just happens. It's a part of trying to isolate them. You just have to keep trying and you know give it multiple shots because uh yeah, it just depends, you know, like if it's something really small, that's when it gets really difficult. Like the crown tip coral, I think the reason why no one had cultivated it yet, or as far as my knowledge goes, is because it was so small and thin, and it's hard to get an actual isolate of it because of it being so small. So like same thing with turkey tail. Like I have tried to get isolates of turkey tail so many times, and I always fail. I feel like it'd probably be easier to just germinate some spores versus trying to get tissue from it. So like depending on the mushroom, if it's too like thin, you know, you people probably usually don't either mess with it. I'm really curious right now on the corals. That's like the biggest thing on my radar is like all the weird corals because it sounds like a lot of people eat them around the world, like almost everywhere. So I'm like, I was always told though that they should be stayed away from and that they're not good for you or you know make you sick. So I was like, I guess I don't know enough about them to really like, you know, make that decision, but there's a lot of really cool corals like purple corals and like so I'm always looking for weirdos that are out there, you know, and I don't know. I am just trying to keep the interest going. I almost lost interest a while ago and got involved with doing cactus stuff instead, but yeah, just had to get myself back out into the woods and collecting stuff again in order to get that inspiration kind of rekindled again. Yeah.
They're successfully isolated in morale.
I've tried a couple times. My buddy that was in here earlier just did, and we're gonna try to do some projects with that this year. It sounds like it's been figured out as far as what the tricks are in China. Like they seem to really have it dialed in now at this point. So I don't see why we can't do it. And they're doing it even indoors at this point on large scale. It was kind of really shocking, but. Yeah, pretty cool stuff. I'm trying to get more involved with the Chinese as much as possible because right now they have obviously been leading the industry for quite some time, but they have a large variety of really weird genetics as well that I'm like, well, I've never even seen that before. You know, like I'd love to get that. And so I'm always reaching out to him like, hey, how can I get one of those? Yeah. Who wants to send to the US? But yeah, that hasn't been successful yet, but
So how do the Chinese morels taste?
that's a good question. I've seen some of the better ones. They're all mostly for what I've seen. I mean, the Danish did the golds or the blondes, but the Chinese, from what I've seen, for the most part, are all doing the blacks. Which there's one species of the blacks that they're doing that looks better than the ones that people are most familiar with that taste like nothing. If you know what I mean by that. Like, there's one that like it's so thin. I forget the actual Latin name of it, but it's like it. There's nothing there really. It's almost like so thin cracker that you don't get much. So I don't know. I really liked the blonde ones. That's the one I'm gonna probably trial the most this coming year. Um, but yeah, I don't know. We'll see where that goes. I haven't like explored it too much, but it's been a difficult one. I've germinated before and isolated it before, but I didn't get to it because just kind of time consuming. These weirdos, sometimes you'll put like a year into a project and have no results and then just be like, all right, that's just how it is, you know, and then you'll move on. So, or try again the next season. So like that happens to me like almost every year where I'm like, oh, I guess next year I'm gonna try again, see how it goes. But you don't always find the same mushroom. So like if it's a really like rare one or something, you know, you want to really like give it your best go on the first try. But yeah. So I'm always like reaching out to people when I see people find weird stuff. I'm like, take that for me, bring it over, let's meet up. Any other questions at all? Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for coming out. I appreciate it. Great.